Hello and welcome to LGIU's Fireside Chats. This is a new interview series for our Future Local Lab programme, and we'll be joined by guests from around the world to discuss what the future holds for local government, with the emphasis firmly on what the sector can do now to start preparing for the future. Today, I'm very pleased to say we're sitting down with Dara Turnbull. Now, Dara has a background as an economist and is currently specialising in researching social and affordable housing alongside economic inequality. He's currently the research coordinator at Housing Europe, based in Brussels, where he leads projects analysing housing market trends across Europe, with analysis provided by over 43,000 housing partners who operate in 24 countries and manage 24 million homes. So this is a huge network and a hugely interesting role that Dara has. Previously, he was research associate at the Nevin Economic Research Institute in Dublin. Additionally, he worked as an economist at the Allied Irish Bank, providing macroeconomic insight, and he studied at the National University of Ireland in Galway and at Dublin City University. So really pleased to have you here, Dara. There's loads for us to talk about. I'm really excited. As I just gave that in that introduction, I mean, there's so much going on in your current role and in previous roles you've operated. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've done over your career, some interesting things that you've learned?
Yeah, of course. Look, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you today. It's a big honor. Indeed, local government has been, I'd say, more indirectly rather than directly something that I've been considering or being wrapped up in for many years now. In fact, my own dad, he worked in one of the local municipalities in Dublin for many years. He was the director of services there in Fingal County Council. So I think local government has been a part of my life since I was a very young child. So indeed, very happy to be here today and contribute to the conversation. So in terms of my own background, I mean, today my focus is primarily on housing, particularly at the European Union level, and on, let's say, transmission of best practices between different parts of Europe to make sure that, good policies that happen in one part of Europe are not kind of siloed and that they make their way to other parts of the continent, which is very important. But I kind of fell into housing quite by accident, I would say. Again, as you mentioned in the introduction, my background is in economics and I worked primarily in the financial sector for about 6 or 7 years. But what happened was that I, as a young person growing up in Dublin, I noticed that things are a bit off. So despite having good jobs, solid incomes, myself and most of my peers basically were still living with their parents into their mid to late 20s. And that's obviously kind of quite a big reversal versus what would have been the norm for my parents' generation or for my grandparents' generation. So in a piece of research we did a few years ago, we pointed out that I think by the age of 27, about 2/3 of people in Ireland actually were homeowners, whereas today in Ireland, 27 is the age at which people tend to actually leave the family home for the very first time, not to become owners, but to enter the private rental market. So it's quite a departure. So I was thinking about these issues around housing. And then one day, after another kind of heated dinner table conversation with my mother, who kind of said, yeah, but look, you think it's hard now, but it was equally hard when I was your age, to get access to housing, and that, you're not really viewing this objectively. So there was an article that she sent me, which basically tried to make this point. They'd taken a look at the history of housing affordability and challenges in Ireland, and they tried to put together the data to answer the question. And the answer that they came up with was that, housing is just as unaffordable or unattainable for millennials, quote unquote, as it was for the previous generation. So I looked into that article and said, okay, I'm an economist. Let's take a look at the findings. And I realized that they had basically used incorrect figures. The methodology wasn't particularly robust. And I said, hang on, surely someone could do better than this. So in my frustration and to prove myself right against my mother, I decided to actually crunch the figures, which surprisingly, no one had ever actually done before. And I published two papers actually off the back of that. And my career basically in housing was launched from there. So from that, I did some consultancy work for the housing agency in Ireland and for other bodies. And then at some point I wanted to change the scenery. And I think I literally Googled the words Housing Europe, social housing or something like this. And I popped up that there was an organization in Brussels called Housing Europe, which was doing just that. And I've been here since 2019.
Fantastic. Wow. It's a great motivator, isn't it? Trying to prove yourself right to family members, especially parents. It doesn't always work out in my experience, but it's good to try. Great, that's really interesting. I mean, we're going to come back, I think, to talk a little bit about that, the sort of the demographic shift, those sort of implications that you touched on there of people staying in the family home for a lot longer than they have in previous generations, and some of the sort of knock-on effects that has, and the ways that that can be approached. Because I think that's really quite profound and quite interesting, and has sort of plays out differently in different countries, doesn't it? So a key part of your current role at Housing for Europe is working for the new EU level Commissioner for Housing, which is something that you've advocated for and Housing Europe has advocated for a long time. Could you tell us a little bit about this new role? What are the aspirations for it? What are you hoping it's going to achieve? But also, what are some of the challenges involved in doing that, and how are you supporting overcoming those challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, this is obviously a very new set of circumstances that we find ourselves in Europe. Up until now, we've never had a commissioner with responsibility for housing. Housing has been at the kind of periphery of a number of different portfolios, social affairs, environment, employment, these kind of issues. And we felt it was important in Housing Europe that there should be someone who's more of a focal point on this issue. We see from opinion polling from across Europe that housing is consistently cited in most European countries, particularly in urban areas, as being one of the key determinants of how people vote in elections, and kind of, especially for younger people and for people in lower incomes. So we felt it was important to have someone who could be a focal point, who we could kind of direct our questions to, and who could bring together the different strands of EU competences on housing, which again, previously up until now was kind of a bit more dispersed. And that was kind of a problem for us, because you would have to have a conversation with someone who's working on social affairs, a conversation with someone working on employment, a conversation working on environmental issues, and they wouldn't necessarily talk to each other. So we would almost become like this quasi-interlocutor between different people in different functions, different roles. And that became a kind of a bit tedious and a bit difficult to manage. So we really felt that that was kind of the key thing. It's important to say that Housing Europe, we are not directly part of the European Union. We are effectively a membership organisation. So as you mentioned in the introduction, we work on behalf of about 43,000 local housing providers. So to give you an example, in Ireland, we have two members, which would be the Irish Council for Social Housing and Cooperative Housing Ireland. Unfortunately, post-Brexit, if I'm allowed to mention the B word, we only have, I think, two members left in the UK, and they're the two Northern Irish members. Unfortunately, our Welsh, Scottish and English members are no longer with us, but they're still very much in our hearts and in our minds and in the work that we do, and we remain in good contact with them. And who knows, maybe at some point in the future we'll welcome them back to the family. So that's the kind of bodies that we represent, and it's important that we maintain a level of independence from the Commission, because we have to be able to be critical of the work that they're producing. Yeah, I think we've really hit the ground running on this in recent weeks. Just this morning, before talking to you, I had a good call with members of the new Housing Task Force, which is a group effectively set up to try to see how it is that the European Union can help to support, without overstepping the mark, help to support member states to do better on housing. And that's important, because housing is not a strict competence of the European Union in the same way that, agriculture or justice would be. But that doesn't mean that the European Union is agnostic about the topic of housing. So really, what we see is it should be a body going forward that can help to support, for example, dissemination of best practices, but also to identify current blockages within the system. So there are lots of regulations and coming from the European level related to things like climate change, decarbonisation, land usage, all these kind of topics, which are not directly about, for example, access to social and affordable housing, but do have a knock-on impact on the work that we do. So we're hoping that the Housing Commission can be a conduit to better identify those kinds of unintentional consequences, and then potentially advocate on behalf of ourselves and other like-minded organizations to make sure that those obstacles are removed, and that member states are better equipped basically to provide affordable housing for people who need it.
So is the Housing Commissioner and the Housing Commissioner's Office, do they sort of relate exclusively to member states, and then through member states to local, municipalities and providers, or is there more of a direct relationship with the EU level? It just feels like there's quite a sort of complex pattern of governance there, which may well just be how things operate. But could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's clear. I won't mention the B word again, but it's clear that the EU is somewhat impenetrable to people who are outside of the little Brussels bubble that I now find myself in. Indeed, I realized that before actually moving to Brussels and working in this environment, I thought I knew how the European Union really worked, and then I found out that actually I knew almost nothing. But it's important to understand that, again, housing is not a strict competence of the European Union. So there is a requirement basically for the Dan Jorgensen, the new commissioner with responsibility for housing, not to overstep the mark too much. So he shouldn't be trying to deliver kind of top-down rules and regulations, but more play a more kind of capacity building and supportive role. So one of the things that we're talking to them a lot at the moment is the fact that if you look at our own field of social and affordable housing or even cooperative housing, there are many countries which are far more advanced in that conversation compared to other countries. Without meaning to stigmatize or kind of stereotype, we see that particularly in Mediterranean countries, some Central European countries, and also kind of Eastern Bloc countries, that effectively they either have not been building sufficient quantities of social affordable housing for many decades, or particularly in the EU accession countries, effectively they stopped building social housing when they transitioned to a market economy in the 90s. So really, there's a very important job that has to be played by the European Union to try to get back into those countries and develop capacity building tools and make sure that the proper structures are there to really make sure that very, very simple things like like capacity to absorb EU funds that currently exist. That's one of the key challenges that we've seen in recent years, that the EU has been doing more or less its part in terms of making funding available to support the development of affordable types of housing, or even the renovation of housing for low-income people who who don't have access to funds to do that themselves. But there's an absorption capacity issue, whereby because we don't have robust legislation at the national level, because we don't have, for example, a national housing agency, and we don't have the systems in place, it's actually very, very difficult for many countries to absorb the funding, even if it is made available to them. And that's kind of an issue because then it creates a two-tier system. So in countries like in Ireland, like in the Netherlands, previously in the UK, of course, those kind of systems and good practices were already quite evolved. And therefore, the countries that already have very well-functioning systems are the ones who are most able to access funding, even if theoretically they have the least amount of need, whereas the countries with the most amount of need also have the least amount of capacity. So it's really those kind of bread and butter issues that we hope the Commissioner can help to evolve.
It's interesting. It's a sort of a kind of unlocking and facilitating role, which yeah sounds really useful. You mentioned you initially got sort of interested really in housing, discussing that sort of demographic change around when people are able to leave home and move into their own home, either rented or to buy, more often to rent, of course. Could you say a little bit about those sorts of trends across continental Europe? What's the sort of pattern? Is that the same everywhere? Do we see a lot of variation?
There's a huge amount of variation. So actually Eurostat produces quite good annual estimates of basically the estimate of the average age at which a person leaves. They call it the family home, but of course we know there are a multitude of living circumstances, but family home is probably a kind of good catch-all term. So the age at which basically a young adult becomes independent and forms their own household. So we have good data on this going back about, depends on the country, but at least a decade in all countries, and then even further back in some other member states. So we can kind of see how this has evolved over time. One of the issues that's interesting is when you actually look at the evolution in that respect, countries that had already 10, 15 years ago quite a low average age of leaving the home, those countries have actually kind of remained quite low or actually even gone lower again. And countries which maybe 10, 15 years ago had quite a high average age have actually seen that push out. So maybe in a country like Italy, someone would have left the home kind of say 28, 29 a decade or 15 years ago. Now it's probably into their early to mid 30s. Whereas a country like Denmark, where I think the average age today is about 21, it would have been at around 21, 22 about 10, 15 years ago. So now, of course, it's important not to stigmatize because there are many cultural norms which have an impact on this. So it is definitely the case that across Mediterranean countries, we see people typically leave the home later than, say, in Northern Europe. And there are many issues as to why that might be the case. So it isn't just a question of housing affordability or access, but also just the norm that people tend to leave home later in those countries for whatever reason. So what we're trying to get to the bottom of in our work is, okay, in which cases are people choosing to stay at home, and in which cases are people actually effectively stuck at home? And that's kind of the key difference that we try to make. And Ireland is a good example from recent work that we've done, where we see that many people who are currently living with their parents would prefer to be forming independent households, but actually because of the lack of affordable housing, for example, that's something they effectively can't do. So that's a key difference.
So how does local government play into that? I suppose in terms of what they can do, perhaps what some local areas are doing, maybe not doing and kind of frustrating that process. But what's some of the sort of best practice, I guess, to help to unlock it?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure I can give you a succinct answer, but I can try to give you the outlines of an answer at least. So again, we know that where housing is available in abundance and relatively affordably, we tend to avoid as much as possible these kinds of problems. So where People, if they choose to stay at home, that's fine, that's their prerogative. But if they want to leave home and effectively can't, that's where we have an issue. So the countries in which people who want to leave home can leave home more easily, we see that in these kind of countries, there does tend to be particular housing categories or housing provision made for these people. So in many countries in Europe, you would have housing providers, some of which are owned directly or indirectly by municipalities and local governments, and some which are supported by them, but effectively independent. So the municipality can be very, very proactive in terms of saying, okay, we as a municipality want to ensure that within our city or within our local area, there is a sufficient stock of homes which are really earmarked and dedicated for the housing needs of younger people. A good example of that might be somewhere like Finland. You have two types of housing providers there. You have municipal housing companies, which are kind of SPVs owned by local government, and then you have housing associations, which are independent but still benefit from local government support. And it's the latter form, the kind of the housing foundations, which would kind of try to, as much as possible, for example, provide housing for students, provide housing for young workers, provide housing for people who maybe are exiting the youth care system, these kind of things. So, there's a lot of good examples from Europe that other countries could learn from in terms of really recognizing that the housing needs of younger people are quite particular, and that the forms of housing that maybe would be appropriate for them are also quite particular. Unfortunately, in many countries, including many parts of the UK and of Ireland, we don't really see those kind of youth-focused housing policies coming forward. Young people tend to be kind of lumped in with the overall housing market rather than being seen as kind of a separate category. In many parts of Europe, they've really taken into special consideration the housing needs of young people rather than kind of trying to lump them in with the overall housing sector and kind of the needs of people who maybe are in their early 20s or early 30s, who maybe are less likely to have children, less likely to be in sustainable kind of cohabitation with the partner, these kind of things. Maybe the housing that they need is not exactly the same as the housing that a young family would need or an older person would need, that kind of thing. So, as I said, there are parts of the UK and Ireland that probably could be learning a lot from peers in Europe where they really do consider the particular needs and situation of young people and make sure that housing that's appropriate for them is available in the market and usually at affordable prices, often subsidized by local municipalities.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that there are those approaches that really focus on particular groups and try to sort of provide products and access for particular groups. I guess one of the challenges that perhaps arises is, and this probably goes for the housing markets and the housing sector more generally, is around timescales and operating over a long term and a short term. The ways that sort of policy can catch up with, it perhaps takes a long time to catch up with some of these demographic shifts, is perhaps due partly to sort of the political cycle, to access to funding and finance taking a long time to kind of run in. And then, of course, the fact that building houses and living in houses, takes place over a much, much longer time frame. So how do these areas manage those sort of competing timescales? How do they operate over a long enough timescale to provide stability and sustainability and so on, and certainty, but to be responsive and agile?
I think so. A lot of the work that I do in Housing Europe is about looking at data to try and draw different conclusions about the need for housing, what sort of housing is likely to be appropriate in the future, and so on. And one of the unfortunate realities is that while we have data, for example, from the census, which is every 5 or 10 years, depending on the country, we have various national research institutes and so on. We don't really, in most countries at least, have actually robust analysis of these kinds of questions. So we did a mapping exercise, my colleagues and I, in the last 2 years to try and see what is the unmet need for housing in Europe. That's kind of the first question that we have. And then could we go more granular than that? Could we say, okay, specifically, what is the unmet need for social affordable housing? What is the need for housing for younger people, for older people, for families, these kind of things? And unfortunately, we know depressingly little about these questions in most countries. Really, the data are effectively not there. I mean, even in quite large countries where they have research institutes which would kind of look at these issues, they struggle to come up with accurate figures. And actually, I don't fully blame them. I mean, many national governments now are putting pressure on ministries to produce, for example, yearly estimates of, okay, how many homes should we be building each year out to 2030 or 2040, whatever it may be, based on demographic needs. And they really struggle to come up with those sort of figures because, to give you one anecdotal example, they tried to do this in Germany in the early 90s when the country unified. and they completely underestimated the number of people who would be coming from east to west. And as a result, they built a lot of housing in the former East Germany, in around cities like Leipzig, and that housing effectively was redundant because the population shift was so dramatic and so quick that there was no one to occupy the homes, and they actually ended up having to demolish some of those homes because they basically were working off faulty premises. So again, I really have a lot of sympathy for agencies who have to try and look at these questions because, in this day and age, unfortunately, trying to really make a strong, robust prediction about demographics, about how that translates into housing and so on, is proving to be increasingly difficult. And it's interesting that even in countries like the UK, like Ireland, where there are those sorts of estimates produced, they're frequently revised. I mean, every 3-4 years they tend to be revised because clearly they just overestimated, underestimated, or didn't provide sufficient insight. So it's definitely an issue that needs a lot more work, but the problem is trying to find a methodology which can retain some value even over the short to medium term, and that's been quite difficult in Europe for a long time now.
Is there something about the sort of the importance of partnerships here to kind of access and analyze that data? Partnerships sort of within the public sector and with government, as well as with providers outside of government in the private, also the third sector. Is that something that is being pursued to sort of access better data, more granular data, more cohesive data that brings in sort of other elements as well as people's direct housing situation?
Yeah, look, I think most of the data that we would look at anyway, and if you think of the UK and Ireland as specific examples, most of the data that would be relevant will be produced by the likes of the ONS in the UK or the CSO in Ireland. I know that in the UK, actually, you're quite privileged. I mention frequently in presentations the example of the housing surveys, which are conducted annually in England and Scotland, and maybe less frequently, but still quite frequently in Wales and Northern Ireland, which do actually give you a lot of very valuable insights, which unfortunately is missing from Ireland, where we rely on Eurostat EU Silk data, and indeed that would be the norm across most of Europe. So it's definitely coming from the public, but where we see valuable partnerships would be, well, it's two things. So the first one to mention is a lot of cities, which have quite a lot of scale, realize that actually they need to be producing their own bespoke research. So in the city of London, for example, there is attached to the Mayor of London a specific housing research unit, which basically produces London-specific analysis of available data sources. So again, that's the private sector, the public sector, I should say. But the people who work there, obviously, most of them come from academia, come from kind of econometric analysis, these kinds of things. So it's kind of leveraging in people from academia and kind of external institutions to come in and kind of really make sense of data at the more granular local level. And that kind of pattern of saying, okay, the national figures will only take us so far. We need to do something really localized where local authorities can take the lead in supporting these kinds of institutions. That's becoming more and more common. We see many of them in France, many of them in Germany, in Spain, now coming on stream more in kind of Portugal, Northern European countries. And it's for the reason that it's become very apparent in recent years that the sorts of indicators that were appropriate in the past just don't cut it anymore. We don't really get enough granularity to develop housing policies which work in specific localities. They're far too high level, far too homogenous. So I think that kind of housing observatory model has been quite successful in recent years. And then, of course, there's also, we see a lot of the estimates that do exist for housing need. They are being produced by third-party institutions, so research institutes. In Ireland, for example, the ESRI, the Economic Social Research Institute, produces a lot of the best figures we have on housing needs, for example, but drawing on publicly available resources.
But going beyond housing needs specifically then, how do we what's the picture in terms of our data and understanding across Europe of how housing policy, housing interventions can be used to help with a range of other sort of policy goals around healthy lives and well-being and sustainability and transition to net zero and all these kinds of things? The LGIU is working with the Irish Housing Agency on a project looking at social cohesion, how housing interventions can be used to boost and strengthen social cohesion, which I know Housing Europe has also written about. But how do we sort of look at that, those achieving those wider policy aims and where that's being done better or less well?
Yep. So actually, when it comes to this kind of issue of social return on investment, as I think it's usually called in the literature, I would say the UK and Ireland are probably ahead of the curve. There are many, many parts of Europe where, again, we know very little, much more than you would expect. If your sphere of reference is the UK and Ireland, you would probably think that what happens there is more or less normal. But unfortunately, that's not really the case. We see that, again, we know far too little about the social return on investment, the social impact from our sector, but just kind of housing more broadly. There is one agency which has produced a couple of really valuable studies on this. It's called Eurofound, which is kind of the research agency linked to the European Commission. It's based in Dublin, actually, but that's just how they spread around the duties around Europe. So it's not something specifically Irish, although they often do link in with Irish authorities. But they have tried to kind of think about what is the impact, as you mentioned, what is the impact on your health of not accessing decent housing? What's the impact on your mental health? What is the impact on your maybe labour market progression and these kind of, externalities that are linked to housing? They have tried to put some figures on this. I'm not going to try and recall the figures off the top of my head, but I know that they did try to estimate what the impact on, say, GDP would be of inadequate housing across Europe. And the figures are there. So, I mean, again, we're talking about billions here spread across Europe in terms of just people who are missing work because they're sick, people who are not accessing employment or education or training because they're effectively locked out of the types of housing markets where those sorts of opportunities tend to be located. But yeah, unfortunately, if your frame of reference is the UK and Ireland, you're quite lucky, actually. That kind of analysis is not really available across most of Europe today. And that's something my colleagues and I would try to push for again. And that bring it back to the earlier conversation about the European Commission. That could be a place where the European Commission adds a lot of value by recognizing these kinds of gaps in our knowledge and understanding and trying to see what efforts could be made either through the likes of Eurostat or through various research funding initiatives to try and understand more deeply these kinds of impacts.
So over the course of your career in this space, then, what are some of the key lessons that you've picked up in terms of, or I suppose a better way of putting it would be kind of key ingredients for success? What really helps, municipalities to improve the housing situation in their local area?
So actually, one of the first things I did when I joined Housing Europe is we worked with the United Nations for about 4 years on an initiative called Housing 2030, which was a link to the Sustainable Development Goals and other work being done by the United Nations on housing, on adequacy, on placemaking, all these sorts of topics. And we tried to essentially answer the question that you've just asked. So what are the key ingredients of a good housing system? What are the recommendations that we could maybe take from countries or from local areas that seem to be doing quite well on these topics and then transfer to other parts of the continent? And one thing we realized quite quickly is that there is no one size fits all approach. That, for example, a lot of the discourse in many countries now would be talking about Vienna, right? Everyone is really with the Viennese housing model and so on, even though when you talk to people who talk about it, you realize quite quickly they don't really understand what it is or how it works. But it's kind of held up as being this really shining example that we should all be trying to emulate. And it is a great model. It's a fantastic system. But they put in place a lot of the infrastructure that led to the outcome they have today over 100 years ago. So it isn't like flicking a light switch and saying, okay, today we're Dublin or today we're London and tomorrow we're going to become Vienna. It doesn't really work like that. So we try to get away as much as possible from the idea of a one-size-fits-all model or from a blueprint and basically say, look, for historical reasons, for sociological reasons and so on, what may work in one country may not be very transferable or applicable to another country. We have to be cognizant of that fact. There's no point in us trying to say to many different parts of Europe, you need to be more like such and such a region or such and such a country, because it's not going to work. They're basically going to tune out of the conversation because they could say, look, these guys are talking way above our heads. So one key piece of advice is try and meet people at the level that they're at today. See what you think could be achievable over the medium term or the longer term.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I'm really interested, Dara, in some of the work that you've done recently around the democratising of housing. Could you say a little bit about that and what the potential benefits, what the positive impacts can be of democratised housing?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, in what we've discussed today, I think probably too much of my focus has been on social housing, public housing, affordable housing, which would of course be quite common in the UK and Ireland. But actually, if you go back to the foundation of Housing Europe in the late 80s, most of our most proactive membership and kind of the impetus behind the creation of Housing Europe was actually more the cooperative housing movement, more so than the public social housing movement, which kind of maybe came into the fold a little bit later in the conversation. And if you look at our membership, we are still very much representing both sides. That is, again, a broad spectrum, as much as is the case for social housing, which can mean many things to different people. Cooperative housing, likewise, can mean many things to different people. But it's built around one central ethos, which is basically housing where people come together, they collaborate, they discuss on common issues affecting them and their neighbours and their local area, and they try to go simply beyond, I turn the key in the front door and I walk into my own apartment, to my own home, I shut it behind me, and then I don't really engage too much with the outside world. It tries to go beyond that and really talking about people who work collaboratively to make better homes for themselves, but also for their community. I mean, I could really talk to you about this all day. I mean, some of the best conversations I've had in recent years have been with grassroots organizations who are kind of trying to represent this cooperative spirit in housing. And it's been, really eye-opening for me because, at least in the Irish context, cooperative housing was something we dabbled with kind of 50s, 60s, maybe 70s, but I don't think it really ever got off the ground, properly speaking. There is a nascent kind of neo-cooperative movement, which is kind of now coming to the fore. You see that, for example, in things like community land trusts, which I know are popping up around the UK and other parts of Europe, which is kind of a new form. So the idea that, okay, the land is owned by a trust that we're all kind of part of in some way, but I own my own home, but there's still a focus on collective decision making around things like renovations, around the use of common spaces, all these kinds of things. There are other really interesting movements that I would mention. So in Barcelona, there's an organization called Sostre Civic, and they're doing some really incredible things around the idea of collaborative housing, democratizing housing, and collective decision making. And that even trickles down all the way to the architecture of the buildings. If you think about it, anyone who's ever lived in an apartment block, more likely than not, that apartment block has actually not been really set up to promote democratization of decision making or around kind of building a sense of place and community. Especially the more modern apartment blocks, they tend to be kind of built very homogenously to kind of cater for as broad a cohort of the population as possible. So Sostre Civic, they're really trying to say, okay, how can we actually put community and collective decision making even into the architecture of the building? And you see things like that. For example, in their apartments, you would not have a utility room. Okay, most people, if you say to them, okay, I'm not going to have a utility room, but I'm also not going to go down to some sort of dark basement where I have to go and fight for a machine with other people. So they've tried to find a compromise between that. So they want people to come together in shared spaces to wash their clothes, but also to have a coffee at the same time, or to where children can play. And it also means that then when you're actually building the homes, you have more kind of square meterage for your living room, for your kitchen, for your dining room, because you're not losing space for utilities and for other things that could actually be done in a more communal way. And it's very, very interesting. All decision making is collective. They have membership. You have to join the cooperative. You have to kind of meet regularly to talk about, okay, how should we use the common spaces? How should we use kind of collective funding for different things? How should we, govern ourselves? All these sorts of things. So that's one side of it. But we also see a number of countries in Europe in which these kind of democratized forms of housing also overlap into social housing and affordable housing. The best one to probably mention would be Denmark. It's not that well known, but actually in Denmark, the housing associations that provide non-profit housing, as they call it, the majority of the seats in the board of management, both at the local level but also the national level, are reserved for tenants. So actually, it's basically a tenant-run model of social housing, which is quite unique. Something a bit similar in Switzerland too, but I mean, Denmark is probably the best example of that. So it's really housing by me, for me. It's housing by people who really know what it is to have a low income for those same cohorts. That could be one of the critiques that we see of the type of housing, public housing, social housing, that maybe the people who come up with the schemes are not the people who will need to access those services themselves in the future, and therefore they just don't fully understand the tenant experience, or they don't fully understand what it is to think about paying your bills at the end of the month or paying your rent at the end of the month. So Denmark has really excelled in that regard because, again, it's people who have first-hand experience with those kinds of issues who are also making the decisions around investment, around renovations, and all these sorts of things, and it leads to a very nice, cohesive outcome. If you go to Denmark, you can visit a lot of really, really vibrant neighborhoods which are built on this kind of tenant democracy principle that has been very, very effective for many decades.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And is that being picked up and shared, that kind of practice? Is there a sort of interesting discussion at the European level in the sort of the kinds of forums that you're involved in? Is there wider interest to adopt those sorts of practices?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something which is coming to the fore more. So, like I said, it could be argued that in many parts of Europe, the cooperative housing movement had become not stale, but they had found a routine, they'd found a model that kind of worked for them, and that had been the kind of same approach for many, many decades. And now we see in a lot of countries there's these kind of new kids on the block, these new cooperative models that are coming to the fore, often linked to kind of maybe local environmental movements or political movements or reform movements, where they're kind of saying, okay, it's fine, we have an existing model, but we think we can do better. We think we can re-energize and reinvigorate what has been a very, very important part of housing policy across many parts of Europe for many decades now. And again, I mean, I think a lot of those new movements, they're trying to see what's happening in more established models like Denmark, like Switzerland, maybe, yeah, I'd say it's probably quite Nordic in its focus. But at the same time, they're also doing something that really makes sense for them. That's kind of one interesting aspect of community-based housing and kind of more democratized forms of housing is that if there's ever a case for not having a one-size-fits-all model and for really relying on locally specific factors, it's those form of housing because the idea of copying and pasting what would be a social norm in Denmark and then saying, okay, we're going to bring that to Barcelona, it's not going to work because your idea as a Dane of good placemaking and good kind of sense of community probably isn't likely the same as someone from Barcelona who maybe has a very, very different conceptualization of what living well with your neighbors looks like. So it's actually very, very grassroots driven and very bottom up rather than kind of top down or borrowing from other parts.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and it really feels like there's so much potential there to help at least to solve some of the challenges around some of the demographic change that we're talking about, those long term shifts, but things that are coming down the track very, very quickly. So it's really encouraging that there's good practice going on there. It feels like that's a sort of a potential positive outcome. I think when we're really coming up to time now, and it's been such an interesting conversation. I wonder if could you sort of give us your thoughts, perhaps quite speculative thoughts over where things are going over the next 12 months, 18 months. There's a lot that's changing in the world very, very quickly at various levels, which obviously has a huge impact on European governance, municipal governments, but residents as well of local places. Where do you see housing markets, access to good housing, some of these challenges that we've been talking about going over the next period?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question. As my boss, when I worked as an economist in the financial sector, said, if I could predict the future, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you, but you sipping a cocktail on a beach somewhere. And that's probably the case there. I mean, things, at least in my lifetime, I'm not that old, but in my lifetime, have probably never been as uncertain as they are now. Political trends are kind of going in one direction in Europe, and maybe that isn't necessarily well aligned to the types of things we've been talking about in the conversation here today. But I mean, I'm still quite optimistic. The fact that we now, again, at European level, we see that there is a renewed focus on housing, access to housing, affordable forms of housing. And what's interesting is that that's quite popular right across the political spectrum, from left to right. And that's something which is probably definitely has not been the case in previous decades where, let's say, public support for housing policies was maybe seen as more of a left-wing issue and then maybe more kind of free market policies as being kind of a right-wing issue. But we see, and again, Ireland is a good example of this, where basically across the political spectrum, because of the fact that the housing situation is as bad as it is for so many people in the population, we see that basically it's not viable politically to ignore the housing question, and it's not viable politically to say that, okay, as a government, we will provide additional capital or additional resources for making sure that the people who currently do not have access to housing have that. And actually, if you look at polling, I think I mentioned already, if you look at polling from across Europe, we see that generally speaking, support for governments to do more on provision of housing, that could be social housing, could be cooperative housing, it could be grants or subsidies. The polling is not that precise, but I mean, generally speaking, there is a recognition from citizens that government should be doing more, and there is generally quite a broad support for additional kind of government capacity building and resource provision and so on. So I'm quite optimistic on that front, that at least if the politics is going in a way that you or I or the people might find a bit worrying, within that, bizarrely, housing has become this kind of unifying force somewhat that kind of more or less everyone agrees we need to be doing better on. And, if there's anything to be positive about in the current context, maybe that's it.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're always keen to have something positive to hold on to in the current context. So yeah, thank you for that. That's really encouraging. Dara, thanks. It's been such an interesting conversation. We've gone in lots of different directions. There's so much that we could, as you said earlier, spend a long time talking about. So loads of food for thought. Really useful, really helpful. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.